The wind that night sang through the valley like something wounded. It clawed at the fences and moaned across the bare ridges, carrying with it the smell of thawing mud and pine sap, a strange mixture of life and loss. Jackson Ronaldo moved through the storm as if carved from the same stubborn earth that bore his name. A tall man, quiet as dusk, he carried his lantern low, its light trembling against the barn doors that rattled like bones in their sockets. He had spent the day mending a fence post that winter's weight had split, and his back ached like an old sin. Yet he still walked the yard before bed, checking every hinge and latch, the habit of a man who had only his work to keep him company. When he pushed open the barn door, a rush of cold air swallowed the light. The horses shifted, breath steaming. The scent of hay and old leather filled the air. Then, something else. A sound small as breath but sharper, human. Jackson paused. He lifted the lantern higher, and the golden circle found two shapes among the hay bales. One was hunched, frail, eyes reflecting fear like an animal caught in a snare. The other, young, pale-faced beneath the grime, stood half in front of the older woman as if to shield her. For a long time no one moved. Only the hiss of the wind and the slow drip of melting frost from the rafters. Jackson's first thought was of trespassers. The winter had driven many desperate folks to theft. But there was no threat in their stance, only the trembling of exhaustion. The younger one whispered something in a language soft and lilting, words he couldn't catch. She reached for the older woman, whose hands shook as she clutched a piece of ragged blanket tighter around her shoulders. Jackson stepped closer. The lantern light reached their faces fully then. The old woman's skin thin as rice paper, her eyes dark and glossy, the younger's lips cracked but proud. Chinese, he realized. The thought came like a memory of rail lines running east, of men he'd seen building them, shoulders bent under the hammer's fall. He remembered the faces the townsfolk turned away from, the cruel names thrown from saloon doors. He set the lantern on a beam and knelt. The boards creaked under his weight. "You'll freeze out here," he murmured, voice rough from disuse. The younger woman understood nothing he said, but something in his tone eased the stiffness in her spine. She looked at him, not with trust, not yet, but with the exhausted awareness of someone who has nothing left to lose. He motioned toward the house. She shook her head quickly, eyes darting to her mother, to the door, to the storm. Fear lived in her like fever. He saw that they had been running. Perhaps from hunger, perhaps from men worse than that. "I ain't here to harm you," he said softly and stood again. He left the barn door open behind him as he walked toward the house. The wind nearly took his hat, the lantern swinging at his side. He built the fire high, filled the pot with broth, and waited. He didn't look back toward the door even when he heard faint steps in the snow. By the time the women entered, the smell of simmering meat and onions filled the small room. The old woman sank before the stove like a pilgrim before an altar, her hands outstretched to the flame. The younger one hovered close, her gaze shifting between gratitude and suspicion. Jackson ladled broth into 2 tin bowls, setting them on the table. He didn't offer words, he could tell they'd mean little, and instead busied himself with splitting kindling. The sound of spoons scraping echoed softly. It had been months since another human voice had touched his walls. He realized he had forgotten how the air could change with the presence of others, how the sound of someone breathing beside you could steady the emptiest parts of the heart. He studied them from the corner of his eye. The older woman's cheeks flushed with warmth, her head nodding with the rhythm of survival. The younger woman's hands were fine-boned, elegant even in weariness, her dark hair escaping the knot at her neck. There was something proud about her stillness, as though even hunger had not taken her dignity. When the fire dropped to embers, she tried to speak. Her English was halting, soft. "We go soon," she said, placing a hand over her chest, then pointing toward the door. "We not trouble." Jackson looked up from his chair. "You'll die out there," he said simply. She seemed to understand the shape of his tone if not the words. She frowned, shaking her head. "No stay. People, bad for us." Her eyes lifted to his, pleading, defiant, both at once. He felt something in him shift, a familiar ache rising, the kind he'd buried since the day his wife coughed her last breath into the same quiet room. He knew what it was to lose everything but pride. "Stay the night," he said. "Till the snow eases." The old woman murmured something to her daughter, a stream of syllables like wind in tall grass. The younger nodded slowly. She bowed her head once, awkwardly, reverently, and guided her mother toward the small cot near the hearth. Jackson sat back, the fire painting his face in gold and shadow. He thought of what the neighbors might say if they knew. Tom Barker, with his cruel laugh, would call it charity for the wrong kind. But Tom didn't live with silence the way Jackson did. Tom had family voices company. Jackson had only echo and memory. The snow thickened outside, sweeping across the plains like the hand of God. The house groaned, its beams swelling in the cold. Yet inside, for the first time in years, there was warmth that wasn't only from the fire. He heard the older woman whisper a prayer before sleep, soft, rhythmic. The younger sat by her, eyes half closed, face turned toward the light. Her shadow flickered against the wall, slender and sure. Jackson found himself speaking without meaning to. "You got a name?" She looked up. For a heartbeat she didn't answer, then pressed her hand to her chest again. "Maylin," she said quietly. Then she gestured to the older woman. "Lee." He nodded. "Jackson." She repeated it softly, tasting the sound, and something gentle passed between them. Something wordless, fragile as the thin frost melting on the window. When he finally turned in for the night, he left the door between rooms open. He lay awake listening to the rhythm of their breathing, the crackle of firewood, the sigh of wind against the eaves. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying tracks, smoothing the scars of the land. Inside, something old and frozen in him began to thaw. He didn't yet know it, but by dawn the town would learn who slept under his roof, and his quiet mercy would soon draw a storm greater than the one that howled across the plains. By morning, the storm had folded itself into silence. The plains lay buried in pale gold light, every fence post capped in white, the barn roof glittering like it had been forged of glass. Jackson rose before dawn as always, his breath rising in small clouds as he pulled on his boots. The house behind him, his house, no longer felt hollow. There was the faint clink of metal, the muted rhythm of hands stirring something in a pot. Maylin was awake. He paused at the doorway. The smell of rice, faint and strange among the usual bacon grease and coffee, drifted through the air. She moved quietly near the stove, feeding the fire with precision, her mother still asleep on the cot under a quilt Jackson had laid out the night before. In the dim light, Maylin's movements were sure, graceful. There was strength in her stillness, the kind built from necessity rather than confidence. He set his hat on the peg and spoke low so as not to wake the old woman. "You cook early." Maylin startled slightly, then nodded, half smiling, uncertain whether he praised or questioned her. "Morning," she said, her accent wrapping around the word like silk around iron. He took his coat and stepped outside. The cold bit his cheeks, but for the first time it felt alive rather than empty. The sound of her quiet voice followed him, an echo that softened the sharp wind. By noon the day thawed enough for him to saddle the horse and ride toward town. He needed supplies, more grain, lamp oil, and maybe a bit of dried fish for their table. The neighbors would talk, they always did. As he crossed the ridge, he saw Tom Barker's cabin in the distance, smoke curling black from its chimney. He could already imagine the questions, the laughter. He braced himself for it. At the general store, Mrs. Gaines eyed him over her spectacles as he laid out the list. "Heard you took in some company," she said, voice mild but watching. Jackson tied the grain sack. "Found 2 women half dead in my barn. Wouldn't have lasted the night." Mrs. Gaines pursed her lips. "Good heart you got, Jackson. But folks talk fast this side of winter." He nodded once, took his things and left. On the ride home, he thought of Maylin bowing her head over the fire, of her mother's thin hands folded like paper. He'd done what was right. He knew that, but right didn't always keep a man safe from the world's eyes. When he returned, the sun was slanting low through the windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny embers. The women had cleaned the place. His tools hung in neat rows. The floor had been swept, the rough table polished with oil. And from the kitchen came a smell so foreign it made his chest ache with curiosity. Ginger, onions, something sweet. Maylin looked up when he entered. "You work much," she said carefully, the words stitched together with effort. He set the supplies down. "And you work more." Her mouth curved, a flicker of humor, the first he'd seen. "We pay, not money. Help. That's fair." Her mother stirred awake and began humming something soft, a melody that wove through the house like smoke, foreign but soothing. Jackson sat by the fire that evening longer than usual. The song filled the empty corners he had long stopped noticing. Days blurred into a pattern, morning chores, quiet meals, evenings by the hearth. He repaired the barn roof with Maylin handing him nails, her eyes steady as he worked. She boiled tea when his hands were red from the cold. They spoke little, but silence became something shared rather than heavy. One night she found an old book of his late wife's, though he hadn't told her that, and traced the faded ink with her fingers. "Read?" she asked. He nodded, unsure what to feel. She sounded out each word, stumbling on the shape of English letters. He corrected her gently, their voices low under the hum of the fire. Madame Lee smiled faintly from her cot, eyes half closed. The house that had been quiet for years began to hum again, breath, warmth, and living sound. But peace was never a thing the world left alone for long. A week later, Tom Barker rode up uninvited. Jackson saw the dust before he heard the knock. When he opened the door, Tom's grin carried the sharpness of a blade. "Heard you turned your ranch into some kind of refuge," he drawled. Jackson didn't answer. Tom leaned on the frame, glancing past him at Maylin washing dishes, her back straight. "Well, ain't that something? Guess every man gets lonely come winter." Jackson's jaw tightened. "You got business here?" Tom spat tobacco into the snow. "Just warning you, friend. Folks don't take kindly to," he gestured vaguely, lowering his voice. "They're kind." The door shut between them before he finished. Inside, Maylin had frozen, her hands trembling above the basin. She didn't look up when Jackson said, "Don't listen to him." Her voice cracked softly. "People always say, in California, in camp, in here. Same." Jackson stood silent. Words had never been his craft, but he wanted to find one that could lift the shame from her shoulders. None came. He took the basin from her instead, rinsed it himself, his big hands careful not to splash. That night the wind rose again, shaking the windows. Madame Lee coughed, her frail body racked with the effort. Maylin held a cloth to her lips, eyes wet. Jackson fetched hot water, his movements brisk but tender. When the coughing eased, Madame Lee whispered something weakly and Maylin translated through tears. "She says, she thanks Mountain Man for fire." Jackson didn't know how to answer gratitude that pure. He only nodded and set another log in the stove. When dawn came, the house was filled with steam from boiling rice. Maylin moved through it like a spirit of smoke, quiet but alive. She caught him watching her and said softly, "You help Mother." "Good man." He shrugged. "Anyone would've." She shook her head, a faint smile ghosting across her face. "Not anyone." It was then he realized what had begun between them wasn't pity but something deeper. Trust, slow as meltwater, building beneath the surface. He had invited them to stay until the thaw, but he found himself dreading the day the thaw would come. That evening, as twilight pooled across the fields, Maylin stepped outside. The air smelled of thawing soil and horses. She lifted a small bamboo flute he hadn't known she carried and began to play. The tune rose thin and haunting over the valley, notes so fragile they seemed made of light itself. Jackson stood in the doorway, the fire behind him, the sky burning with the last of the sun. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply listened, because for the first time in years, his house had a voice again, and he feared breaking its spell. When the final note faded, she turned to him. In her eyes was both gratitude and warning, as if she already sensed the trouble gathering beyond the hills. Jackson stepped forward, the snow creaking under his boots, and said quietly, "The wind carries far here." She nodded. "Then let it carry something good." But the wind that night did not carry good alone. Far off, on the ridge above the frozen valley, a lantern flickered where no rancher should be, its glow steady, watching. And the peace that had filled his home began to tremble like glass before a storm. The thaw came slow that year. It crept through the valley like a shy visitor, softening the snowdrifts around Jackson's fence lines, turning the river into a dark mirror that carried broken ice downstream. Calves bleated in the lower pasture, and the smell of wet earth replaced winter's sharp stillness. Yet inside Jackson's ranch house the warmth felt fragile, as though the smallest breath could scatter it. The lantern that had glimmered on the ridge a week ago had not returned, but rumors had. Jackson heard them at the feed store, between the rattle of grain sacks and the scrape of boots. A woman whispered that he'd lost his mind living with heathens. A man muttered that the sheriff might need to take a look up that way. He ignored them or tried to, but he could feel their eyes on his back like thorns. At home, Maylin noticed the change in him before he said a word. His silences grew longer, heavier. He ate less, stared at the horizon more. She kept to her chores, washing, tending the chickens, helping her mother, but there was an unease in her movements now, a faint tremor in her hands when she poured tea. She had lived with suspicion her whole life. She could feel it approaching like weather. One evening, she stood by the window as the last snow melted from the barn roof. "You hear them," she said softly. Jackson didn't ask how she knew. "They'll forget soon enough." "No," she murmured. "People do not forget difference." He looked at her, then really looked, at the strength beneath her calm, at the sadness carved into her posture. "You shouldn't have to leave again," he said. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes leaving keeps you alive." Before he could reply, Madame Lee began to cough. The sound tore through the room, violent and wet. They both rushed to her. Jackson fetched water, while Maylin supported her mother's frail frame, whispering words that cracked with fear. The cough subsided, leaving the old woman trembling. Madame Lee's eyes found Jackson's and held them. In halting English she rasped, "Wind carries bad heart." Jackson didn't answer, but her words lingered. The next morning he saddled his horse and rode into town to speak with the sheriff. He told himself it was precaution, not fear. Sheriff Halburn was an old acquaintance, fair mostly though not brave. Inside the small office, Jackson stood among the smell of coffee and gun oil. "I've heard some talk," the sheriff said, wiping his spectacles. "About 2 Chinese women living up at your place." "Talk's just talk," Jackson replied evenly. The sheriff sighed. "You know how folks get. There's been trouble before, out east at the rail camps. Don't want no repeat of that. They're not hurting anyone. Maybe not. But Barker's been stirring things. Claims he saw smoke from your chimney and heard strange music. You best keep things quiet, Jackson. Don't give them reason." Jackson rose. Sometimes reason's just another word for fear. He left before the sheriff could answer. The ride home felt longer than usual. Clouds rolled low over the mountains, heavy with unfallen rain. He passed Barker's property, saw the man splitting wood, eyes narrow as if he'd been waiting for him. Jackson didn't slow, but he felt the weight of that stare all the way home. When he arrived, Maylin was kneeling in the dirt behind the barn, planting something in the thawing soil. He dismounted quietly, watching her press seeds into the earth with reverent care. "What are you growing?" he asked. "Garlic," she said. "Mothers say it keeps away sickness." She glanced up at him. "An evil man." He almost smiled. "We could use both kinds of luck." Madame Lee slept most days now, her body fading like a candle nearing its end. In the evenings, Maylin read aloud from the same book she had practiced with, her accent still lilting but surer. Jackson listened from the chair by the window, the words like small stones skipping across the silence. He didn't understand half of what stirred in him during those hours, only that the quiet no longer felt empty. But the peace fractured one afternoon when hoofbeats echoed down the road. Jackson stepped outside, wiping his hands on his trousers. 2 riders approached, Tom Barker and another man, both with rifles slung carelessly across their saddles. Tom grinned wide. "Afternoon, neighbor. Thought we'd drop by, see if you're still keeping company." Jackson's expression didn't change. "You got business here?" "Just concern is all. Sheriff says you're harboring folks who don't belong. We figured we'd take a look." Jackson stood between them and the house. "You'll look from there." Tom chuckled. "You always were the righteous sort. Maybe you forgot, this land's white land. Ain't for their kind." Jackson's voice was low but steady. "This land's for whoever's still breathing come winter's end. That includes them." Tom's grin soured. "Careful, friend. Don't make enemies you can't afford." Jackson took a step forward, and for the first time Tom looked uneasy. The air between them thickened, heavy with all the unsaid things men used to measure one another. Finally Tom spat in the dirt and turned his horse. "You'll regret this." Jackson watched them disappear down the road, the horizon trembling with heat despite the lingering cold. When he turned, Maylin was standing in the doorway, her mother behind her. She didn't ask what had been said, she already knew. That night, the sky opened and rain poured in sheets. Thunder rolled across the plains. Inside, the roof drummed like 1,000 fists. Madame Lee's fever returned, her breaths came shallow, trembling. Maylin sat by her side, whispering prayers in the language of her childhood. Jackson tended the fire, his shirt damp from the leaking roof. Hours passed. The fever worsened. At last, Madame Lee's eyes fluttered open. "No cry," she whispered to Maylin. "We go when spring comes." Her daughter wept anyway, her tears falling on her mother's frail hands. Jackson turned away, unable to watch grief take root again. He stepped outside into the rain, lifting his face to the storm. The smell of wet soil and pine filled his lungs. By dawn the rain had stopped. Inside the house was still. Madame Lee lay peaceful, her skin pale as parchment, her lips curved in a faint smile. Maylin knelt beside her, eyes dry but hollow. Jackson knelt too, saying nothing. There was no language for this kind of quiet. They buried her on the small hill behind the barn, where the morning light first touched the land. Jackson carved a simple marker from wood and pressed it into the earth. Maylin placed her mother's flute beside it, wrapped in cloth. When she rose, she looked older somehow, like winter had marked her bones. That evening she lit incense on the porch. The smoke curled upward, silver and sweet. "In my home," she said softly, "we burn this for those who go ahead. It shows them the path." Jackson nodded, watching the smoke drift into the dark. "She'll find her way." For a while they stood together, neither moving. The silence between them no longer frightened him. But the peace lasted only a breath. From the valley below, faint voices carried on the wind, men shouting, dogs barking. Jackson stiffened. Mayleen's eyes widened. He moved to the edge of the porch, scanning the dark. Lanterns flickered among the trees, moving slowly, deliberately, like a hunt. "They're coming," Mayleen whispered. Jackson reached for the rifle by the door. "Then we'll be ready." She stepped closer, her hand touching his sleeve, trembling. "You saved us once. Maybe we run this time." He looked at her, at the fear and fire in her gaze. "I don't run from my own land." Lightning flashed far off, illuminating the horizon in a brief white blaze. The lanterns below glowed brighter now, 10 maybe more, advancing through the mist. Inside the house, the last of Madame Lee's incense smoldered, its smoke curling like a spirit refusing to leave. Maylin turned toward it, whispering a prayer that mingled with the rising wind. Jackson stood in the doorway, the rifle across his arm, the storm gathering once more beyond the hills. The peace that had once made his home feel whole was gone, replaced by something fierce and sacred. He looked at Maylin, her hair loose, her eyes steady, and understood that the quiet life he had guarded so long was over. The wind carried the sound of men calling his name. He closed the door softly as though sealing a promise, and the fire inside leapt higher, as if the house itself knew the fight had come. The valley burned with its own kind of silence before the men arrived. The sky had that bruised color that comes before dawn, purple over ash, heavy with a stillness that felt like breath held too long. Jackson stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching the slow flicker of torches descend the ridge. The sound carried strangely through the air, hooves striking thawed earth, voices rough and laughing, a dog barking without pause. He had heard such sounds before, after wars, after funerals, when something ugly in men needed release. Behind him, Maylin wrapped her mother's scarf around her shoulders, the scent of incense still faint in its folds. The smoke from Madame Lee's burial fire had not yet faded from the hill, but already another fire threatened to take its place. Jackson turned as Maylin stepped forward, her face pale in the half-light. "You can still go," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No more running." He looked at her, at the steadiness in her eyes, and nodded once. "Then stay behind me." Down below, the first figures broke from the trees, Tom Barker at their head, his hat low, his coat collar turned up against the cold. Around him moved 7, maybe 8 men, all armed. Some carried rifles, others torches. The orange glow flared against the wet ground, painting the snowbanks red. Jackson recognized a few faces, neighbors who'd once shared whiskey or a handshake. Now they came like ghosts wearing masks made of hate. He moved to the yard's edge, boots sinking into thawed mud. "You can turn around," he called. "Ain't nothing here worth dying over." Tom laughed. "That so? Folks say you're harboring devils, Jackson. Women who whisper spells, who curse the land." Jackson raised the rifle slightly, though it stayed pointed at the ground. "You know me better than that." "Maybe I don't," Tom said, stepping closer. "Maybe grief's made you soft. Maybe it's time someone reminded you where you live." The other men murmured their agreement, shuffling like cattle smelling blood. Behind Jackson, Maylene's voice rose, soft, firm. "This is not your land to cleanse. This is where my mother sleeps." The men paused, startled by the clarity of her words. Her accent was thick, but her meaning sharp as the wind. Tom spat into the dirt. "She talks like she owns the place." "She belongs here same as any," Jackson said. "You saying they're equal?" one of the men sneered. "I'm saying they're human." Tom's grin was a wound. "Then they can burn like humans too." The torch arced before Jackson could move. It struck the corner of the barn, catching on the dry straw stacked high beneath the eaves. Flames crawled up the wall, licking toward the sky with a hungry hiss. The horses screamed inside, thrashing against their stalls. Jackson swung the rifle up and fired into the air. The blast split the night like thunder. "Enough," he roared. "Back off before I start aiming lower." The sound froze the mob for a heartbeat. Some wavered, glancing toward the growing fire. But Tom didn't move. His eyes gleamed with something past reason. "You'll hang for this, Jackson," he said. "You protect them, you die with them." Maylin darted past Jackson before he could stop her. She ran to the barn, her small figure framed by firelight. "No!" he shouted, chasing her, heat washing his face as he grabbed her arm. But she was already cutting the ropes on the stall doors, the horses bursting out in panic. Smoke rolled across them, thick and choking. "Get out," he ordered, dragging her backward as the roof groaned above. They stumbled into the yard, coughing, faces streaked with soot. Behind them, the barn's roof collapsed with a sound like the earth breaking open. Sparks scattered across the field, swirling in the wind like wild stars. The mob stood in shock, their torches dim beside the inferno they'd created. Jackson lowered his rifle slowly. "Go home," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Tell your wives you tried to be men tonight and failed." For a moment no one spoke. Then Tom raised his rifle. "You think you can shame me, you?" The rest never came. Jackson's shot hit the ground an inch from Tom's boot. The man stumbled back, pale, muttering curses. "This ain't over," he said, but there was no conviction left in him. One by one the others turned, retreating into the trees, their courage collapsing with the firelight. When the last torch vanished, the valley sank into a darkness broken only by the burning barn. The smell of wet ash and smoke thickened the air. Jackson dropped to his knees, exhausted, staring at the ruin. The barn had been his father's, built plank by plank before Jackson could even walk. Now it was nothing but flame and memory. Malin knelt beside him, coughing softly. "You should not have fought them." "I couldn't stand by," he said. "Not again." "Again?" He hesitated. "My wife died because I waited. Fever came to the valley, folks said it was God's will. I prayed instead of acting. She burned up from the inside while I did nothing." He looked at the barn's dying fire. "Never again." Malin's gaze softened. "Then you have already changed." They sat there until the flames began to die, their faces lit by the shifting gold. The horses, freed, grazed nervously near the fence. A breeze picked up, carrying the smell of char and pine down the valley. Jackson stood, helping Malin to her feet. "We'll rebuild," he said, though he didn't know if he meant it. "You will," she said quietly. "I will help." In the silence that followed, the sound of her mother's flute seemed to whisper through the air, though the instrument lay buried beneath snow and ash on the hill. Malin tilted her head, listening, tears catching the firelight. "She is not gone," she murmured. "The wind carries her." He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that not everything good turned to smoke. They worked until dawn, smothering the last embers, covering the blackened remains with snow. When the sun rose, the light caught on the frozen ash, turning it silver. It looked almost beautiful, like something reborn rather than ruined. By mid-morning, the valley was quiet again. Jackson fetched water from the creek, his hands raw and blistered. Malin waited by the house, the scarf still around her shoulders, her hair damp with sweat and smoke. When he returned, she took the bucket and poured it over the last smoking beam. Steam rose between them, curling in the cold air. She looked up at him then, her voice low. "They will come back." He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Her eyes lingered on his face, searching for something beyond words. "You could still send me away." He shook his head. "This is your home now." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached into her pocket and drew out a small bundle of cloth. Inside lay the flute, cracked from heat but still whole. "She wanted music here," she whispered. "Not fear." Jackson watched her lift it to her lips. The sound that came out was soft at first, broken, uncertain, but it grew, weaving through the valley like mist rising from the earth. The notes trembled over the charred ground, drifting toward the morning sky. The melody found something in him he hadn't known was still alive. As she played, he felt the ache in his chest ease, replaced by something heavier yet truer, grief braided with peace. He reached out, brushing a strand of soot from her cheek, and she didn't pull away. When the song ended, she lowered the flute, her breath shaking. "She says thank you," Malin murmured. Jackson swallowed hard. "Then tell her, she's welcome here as long as I am." The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the fields. Smoke curled up from the ruin, turning the air warm and shimmering. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, its wings cutting through the pale light. Jackson turned toward the ridge. He thought he saw movement, a single rider far off, watching, then disappearing into the trees. Maybe it was Tom, or maybe only his own fear lingering like a shadow. Either way, he knew the peace wouldn't hold forever. He looked back at Malin, standing in the sunlight with her mother's flute in her hand, her face calm despite the ruin around her. For the first time since the war, he felt that saving something small and good was worth any cost. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke down the valley again. It brushed against his skin like a warning and a promise both. And though the fire was out, Jackson knew, deep in his bones, that the real storm had only just begun. Morning came like forgiveness. The valley glowed pale and damp, wrapped in mist that smelled of char and wet earth. Jackson stood by the fence line, his palms rough and split, the smoke of yesterday's fire still whispering in the soil. The barn was gone, only a ribcage of black timber left behind, but the horses grazed nearby, alive. For a long while he simply breathed, watching the steam rise from their backs into the silver light. After years of silence and loss, he could feel the world stirring again, raw, imperfect, alive. Behind him, Maylin stepped out of the house, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the cold. Her hair, dark and unpinned, caught the wind, and her face was pale from the night's exhaustion. She carried a bucket of milk in both hands, its surface trembling like a small moon. "For breakfast," she said softly. Her English had grown steadier, her voice gentler in his language. He took it from her, their fingers brushing. The contact startled him, not because it was improper but because it felt real, warm, human, like something sacred passed between callous skin and silk-soft hands. She looked up, saw the heaviness in his expression and said, "We live." "We do," he answered, his voice rough. "But there'll be trouble yet." Maylin nodded. "Trouble always comes. But maybe peace comes after." He almost smiled. Together they walked toward the stream where the air smelled of thawing moss. The land was still wounded, the ashes streaked with the black bones of what had burned, but the first signs of spring whispered through the frost. Buds clung to the willows, fragile and bright as hope. She knelt, rinsing the bucket, her sleeves rolled up, her movements graceful even in weariness. Jackson watched her in silence. He wanted to tell her how much she had changed the rhythm of his days, how her quiet strength had carved a space inside him where loneliness used to live. But he didn't know the words. Words he'd learned were smaller than what mattered. When they returned to the house, Maylin began to cook. The smell of rice and broth filled the air, mingling with smoke and the faint sweetness of milk warming on the stove. She hummed under her breath, a fragment of the same tune her mother used to play. Jackson sat at the table, his hands folded, listening. He thought of Madame Lee's grave on the hill, the flute buried in snow, the way Maylin had stood against the men without flinching. He thought of the cost of mercy and how it had remade him. She placed a bowl before him. "Eat," she said simply. He did, though the taste caught in his throat. "You shouldn't have to stay here," he said after a moment. "There'll be more talk. More men like Barker." She met his gaze steadily. "You think I am afraid?" "No. I think you deserve quiet." She smiled faintly. "Quiet is not peace. Peace is when heart does not hide." The words struck him deeper than he expected. For years his heart had hidden, from love, from loss, from the mirror of another's kindness. Now, across the table, he saw his reflection in her eyes, not as a man broken but as a man reborn. A knock came at the door then, soft but firm. Jackson rose slowly, hand resting near the rifle by the wall. When he opened it, he found Sheriff Halburn standing there, hat in hand, face weathered by sleepless nights. "Morning, Jackson," the sheriff said. "Heard about the fire?" Jackson said nothing. The sheriff looked past him, seeing Maylin at the table. "Town's divided," he continued quietly. "Some folks think you brought this on yourself. Others say Barker's crowd went too far. Either way, there'll be no charges. Not if you keep the peace." "I never went looking for war," Jackson said. The sheriff nodded. "Then don't start one now." He hesitated, glancing once more at Maylin. "You got good people here. Don't let the world make you forget it." When he was gone, Jackson stood for a long moment, staring at the empty path. Maylin approached and touched his arm. "He mean to help? Maybe. Or maybe he's just tired." "Tired can still be kind," she said, and her touch lingered. The sun climbed higher, turning the mist to gold. They spent the day rebuilding in silence, gathering what hadn't burned, laying stones where the barn would rise again. When the wind picked up, it carried not smoke this time, but the scent of pine and milk and clean air. Jackson felt his shoulders ease beneath the weight of it. By evening, they had built a small shelter for the animals. Maylin's hands were blistered, streaked with soot, yet she worked without complaint. When they paused, she poured him tea from a dented tin kettle. "You do not rest," she said. "Neither do you." Her lips curved. "Because we build same thing." He looked at her questioningly. "Home," she said. The word hung between them like a blessing. As dusk fell, the sky turned to melted amber, and the valley glowed with the kind of beauty that comes only after destruction. Jackson walked her up the hill to her mother's grave. They carried a candle, its flame trembling in the wind. He set it in the earth beside the marker he'd carved, while Maylin knelt and scattered petals she had saved from the winter. She whispered something he didn't understand, a prayer or promise in her own tongue. Then she looked up. "She see us," she said. "She happy now." Jackson crouched beside her. "If she can see us, she knows you made me better." Malin shook her head. "You made yourself better. I only remind you of light." He studied her face in the fading glow, the smudge of soot along her jaw, the glint of candlelight in her eyes. "You staying?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. The breeze stirred her hair, carrying the faint scent of ash and blossoms. "If I stay," she said at last, "you let me belong. Not guest. Not burden. Belong." "You already do," he said. For a heartbeat, neither breathed. Then she smiled, shy but sure. "Then I stay." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small silver ring, bent from a horseshoe nail, polished smooth. "I made this last night," he said. "Didn't plan to show it yet." Her eyes widened. "For me?" "For the woman who rebuilt my life." He slipped it gently onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along. The wind sighed through the valley, and somewhere a hawk cried, sharp, clear, alive. When she leaned into him, he wrapped his arms around her, feeling the pulse of her heart against his chest. It wasn't passion that filled the moment, but peace, earned, quiet, real. Below them, the first shoots of grass broke through the scorched ground. The world was remaking itself, one fragile breath at a time. Malin lifted her face to his. "Morning comes again," she whispered. "It does," he said, looking toward the horizon, where light spilled over the hills like milk poured from heaven. "And we'll meet it together." The candle flickered, then steadied, burning clean against the dawn. And far off, beyond the ridge where the town lay, a single bell tolled, soft, distant, uncertain, as if marking the end of an old life and the beginning of something brave and new.